This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Last month, I made a video about building my new homebrew world for future D&D campaigns. In that process, I sketched out the rough ideas for a few different civilizations, but they were all still pretty loose. This one is based on Camelot, this one is kind of Viking style, this one's more like Greece, etc. But today I'm going to zoom into one of those kingdoms and begin to flesh out the government a bit more. Who's in charge? How is their society organized? And, most importantly, how can these choices open the door to some D&D adventures for our players? See, like I said in my last Critical Role Demystified video, we're talking about politics. Why, what'd you think I meant? If you like this video and you want to see more like it, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. I'm also currently dealing with a very angry algorithm wizard, so it would really help me out a lot if you can show some love to the non-Critical Role videos on my channel. Help boost them up a little bit. I would really appreciate it. And now, on with the show. Now, before we start doing our work and defining one of these governments, let's make sure we're on the same page about our goals. Because for me, the entire purpose of politics in D&D, the entire purpose of world building in general, is to act as a justification for more D&D adventures. That's it. That's the #1 priority. There are other benefits to having a fleshed out political system in your campaign setting. It adds to the verisimilitude, it gives players something to do with their downtime, you can even use it for snarky social commentary. You might even see some of that in this video. But the primary goal is just to generate more D&D adventures. For example, in Critical Role's Mighty Nine campaign, war is brewing between the Dwendalian Empire and the Kryn dynasty. I'm sure when he was preparing the campaign and designing this corner of the setting, Matt Mercer hoped one day that this would lead to some future scenario where the players might actually meet the nobility in charge of one or both of these nations, because I think that is just kind of expected as you play high-level D&D. You start being involved in a lot more political scenarios. That was a major part of the Vox Machina campaign. But at low levels, the government and the brewing war merely existed to set up D&D adventures for our players, opening the door for plot hooks that were all inspired by different aspects of the war, with different factions hoping to achieve different goals, either relating to the war, or, with some of the criminal factions, taking advantage of the war to accomplish some other tasks while everyone else was distracted. So that's going to be something we have to keep our focus on today. It's not just about creating a cool and unique government, either that runs the way we think it should, or that sort of plays out dramatically as a result of what we've established. Our goal is to leave this brainstorming session with a scenario that is going to lead to other D&D adventures. Okay, so now that we're on the same page, let's start world building. As I alluded to earlier, this setting has multiple different nations, but today we're only focusing on one of them, the one I referred to as our Camelot equivalent in the first video. And first of all, I already know what I want to call this nation. Doriad. It's a name I've specifically been saving for some sort of English Empire analog for a few years now. But let's also talk about the influences on this setting. I've been referring to it as a sort of Camelot-style place, and that's because I think I want this to be a land with knights and dragons and fairies. I think for a lot of people, they'll understand if you design something to be kind of like Camelot, they'll have a very clear mental image in their heads about what sorts of adventures to expect. It's not going to be a one-for-one. Instead, it's kind of riffing on the idea of Camelot and taking it in another direction. Think of it kind of like how Ahriman from Critical Role riffs on both Exandria and Middle-earth, but it very deliberately deviates and goes in a very different direction to try to show the audience something they would be familiar with and explore some similar themes, but from a very different perspective. I think we're going to do basically the same thing, because here's the thing. I think a lot of us generally associate Camelot with a king who has basically brought peace to the land. King Arthur is supposed to be such a great and virtuous king that it is really meant to be a time of great peace and prosperity. But we can't have that. If the king has solved all the problems, there's going to be nothing for our adventurers to do. Also, if you're more familiar with the Arthurian myths than I am, which I'm sure many of you are, then I'd imagine you have a very different take on whether or not you can still have D&D adventures in a world run by King Arthur. I bet you could. But that's kind of my point. I'm somebody who knows very little about the Arthurian myth other than just vibes. And so that helps me understand what sort of mindset my players will likely be in when they enter this kind of world. Down the road, I do want to read things like The Once and Future King. I want to check out other resources to get a broader idea of the Arthurian myth writ large, and I'm sure I'll be able to rate it for ideas for future adventures. But for right now, it's really useful for me to understand what the average person thinks of someplace inspired by Camelot, since that helps me figure out a good baseline for my players' expectations. And speaking of which, what do most people know about Camelot and King Arthur? Well, the first thing that came to mind was Excalibur and the Sword and the Stone, which I know are two different swords. I don't know how common that knowledge is, but I think they both serve the same purpose. They are iconic weapons. But we also all know the story of the Sword and the Stone, which is that only the true King of Britain could have drawn the sword from the stone. And Of course, these days, that's very reminiscent of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer from Marvel Comics and the movies. There's a scene in the first Thor movie where a bunch of yokels try to lift the hammer, and it basically turns into a tailgate party, and that always felt to me like the perfect representation of what would have happened if the Sword and the Stone actually turned up in modern day. And so, these two ideas paired together give me my first idea for this kingdom. Our king should be known for wielding some sort of iconic weapon. Now, if you saw my video about Matt Colville's Collaborous livestream, you know that those live streams were very much on my mind when I was developing this world, and that is still the case. And there's a moment in those live streams that I loved. When he was figuring out the details about the Dead Kingdom, he figured out that some old kings and generals have basically become the equivalent of ring wraiths. And he said that there were 9 Nazgul in Lord of the Rings, and 10 Taken in the Black Company, which were kind of the same idea, but they went up to Lord of the Rings by adding one more bad guy. And so in the Dead Kingdom, they would have 11, because this world that Matt Colville was creating was obviously even better. It's better because there's one more. Obviously that's tongue-in-cheek, but the message was still pretty clear. Steal what you think is cool, change a detail so it's not as recognizable, and fuck it, make it more awesome by making it more powerful, in this case by raising the number of enemies. So let's take that same philosophy and one-up these iconic weapons. Instead of a sword or a hammer, this king of Doriad has an axe. Arthur pulled the sword from the stone, Thor lifted his hammer off the ground, and that's how you know they're worthy. But first of all, I don't think our king is King Arthur, mostly because I don't believe that's dramatic. I think our King Arthur equivalent lived several generations ago. And if the modern king isn't worthy, then what happened to the axe? Maybe it's stuck somewhere and no one can move it, like Mjolnir or the Sword in the Stone. But maybe it's not sitting somewhere on the ground. Part of the fun of a D&D world is you have the freedom to make your world just a little bit weirder by including things that wouldn't really fly in other settings. So maybe the axe is suspended in the air. Or maybe it hangs over the king's head wherever he goes. There's some ritual when the king is coronated where the axe rises above their head, and if the king is not actually worthy of the crown, they're immediately executed. Otherwise, they wear the crown and they walk around and they just have this axe floating above their heads. So maybe our king isn't completely unworthy, because obviously if they were, they would have been killed by this sort of literal divine judgment. And I love the fact that the axe follows the king around, because that means it's not a one-time assessment. A king can do something that makes them no longer worthy. There was a comic book where Thor heard a secret and then he couldn't lift his hammer anymore, because just hearing somebody say this truth and Thor's internal response to hearing it made him no longer worthy. Similarly, I would imagine there's some story or piece of lore from our world where a former king received a scroll from an attendant, read it, put it away, not even acting on it in any way, and then immediately the axe came down on his head. At any point, a king can wind up getting executed by the axe if it no longer thinks they're worthy of their job. It's a magical sword of Damocles. This gives me a lot of opportunities to go in and add stories from the past, exploring different possibilities this premise implies. Like maybe sometimes the axe floats at different levels, and people would read all sorts of different meaning into why that might be. The higher the axe floats above you, the more worthy people assume you are. The closer it is to you, the more precarious your situation. Maybe there was one king who basically had the axe floating so close to him it was practically resting on top of his head for his entire reign. He was actually a very good king. He did a lot of great things for his people, but he did so because he lived his entire life in fear that the axe would simply drop a few inches and cut his life short. I would love to come up with a really pithy nickname for that king based on that story, but I'm not George R.R. Martin. I'm really not as good at coming up with those sorts of nicknames that feel organic, but I will have to brainstorm that in the future because that is way too much fun of an idea to not use in the world in some way. However, this essentially means that whoever is king right now is ostensibly a good person. Otherwise, we assume the axe would have come down on them. And that is potentially an obstacle when we're discussing setting up a scenario where D&D adventures can flourish. A great king does not necessarily make for a great environment for D&D adventures because we assume great kings are trying to use all their resources to solve all the problems. And that basically means that adventurers are no longer required. You can't have superheroes in a world where all of the systematic problems are actually being addressed and crime is going down. Yes, you can still have supervillains for them to fight, but hopefully you still get my point. And unless a great king is dealing with some very severe obstacles, it's difficult to imagine how you can still have any sort of intriguing political intrigue if you have a truly great king. Actually, that's not completely true. I can absolutely think of stories of great leaders who were dealing with other obstacles that kept them from accomplishing what they wanted, but those were stories about the politics and the compromises and things like that. They were about those characters in politics. The problem with the D&D story is that the heroes will always want to try to report to the authorities. They'll always want to try to pass off problems to whoever they feel like should actually solve them. And if you have a king who is actually trying to solve these problems, that's where I think I have a harder time figuring out how to keep the king from solving all these problems when the players eventually manage to get an audience with him. Again, I want to acknowledge there are ways to do this well, but I've seen this become a problem so many times that I just want to kind of remove it from even being a factor. I want to make sure this king is not somebody who can solve all of our problems if you can get a hold of him. Not just because there's bureaucracy, not just because of some other faction getting in the way, because of some other barrier. This king is not out there trying to make the world a better place. Because if they are, then theoretically the king would want to take meetings with people who want to help save the world, like our D&D adventurers, and I don't want that. I don't want the king to be wanting to do outreach to the good people. However, I think we can also imply that even this situation, with the axe floating above the king's head, is a compromise of sorts. It's already a sign that this civilization has fallen from its former heyday. Because this next part would not be common knowledge, but maybe it's something the players could learn over time if they get curious about it, gradually digging into the history of this nation, either as part of an adventure or because they just want to know more. But they would learn that the old kings, our Arthur equivalent and his immediate descendants, didn't live their lives beneath the blade. They carried the axe. There were still stories of impure kings who were killed during their coronation, but other kings would still carry the weapon. But no king has been able to do that for centuries. Now they act like it's a great success when the axe doesn't fall, but there are maybe a few historians out there who know that the king is supposed to carry the blade. And so the fact that no king or queen has been able to do that in generations and it just floats above their heads, that kind of indicates that these are not great kings. And that's a really interesting idea. Just because the king isn't so villainous that the axe would fall and cut their head off or cleave their head in two, that does not mean that they are actually a great king. And in fact, I think it actually opens the door for more political intrigue. What made Robert from Game of Thrones a bad king? It wasn't that he was capricious or cruel or sadistic or wanted people to suffer. In his private moments, he did consider what his people might think of him if he couldn't defend them from their invaders. His biggest problem was that he was lazy and inattentive. Everyone else around him ran the country for him while he spent all his time drinking and whoring. He was practically a figurehead, only in his case, that was by choice. Then you have something like the Earth King in Avatar: The Last Airbender, where he seems like a perfectly nice enough guy, but he is completely insulated from the war or any other major systemic problems like inequality. And so he was a bad king because he literally wasn't involved in the running of the country. He was absolutely a figurehead. And I think the exact same thing would happen with the rulers of Doriad. At a certain point, all of the political factions wouldn't want to involve the king or queen in the running of the day-to-day, because if he doesn't get involved, then he can't become corrupted by terrible decisions. And thus he won't lose his head, and apparently, the country will remain stable because the king will still be alive. I imagine a monarch dying is always a little bit of a turbulent time, but that would especially be true if the cultural consensus was that the premature death of that monarch meant they were literally unworthy of the crown. If that were to happen, people might start to ask some questions that people in power don't want them to ask. Like, hey, if our king was unworthy, maybe that means that society should be changed in some way. And you can't have that. Better to just leave the king out of the important business of ruling so that he never has a chance to make a mistake or even read a scroll that might cost him his head. His advisors can even give him tasks that are apparently charitable or productive or consequential, making him feel like he's actually improving the kingdom when they are merely giving him something to occupy his time with. I'm reminded of Game of Thrones again, with Marjorie donating food to the poor people in the city. This obviously does nothing to improve material conditions for these people beyond just giving them a meal for a night. It doesn't raise them out of poverty. It doesn't destroy the feudal system that keeps them oppressed. It doesn't grant them any democratic power. But it makes the people like the royals, and it makes the king feel like he's doing something useful and getting praised for it, which is potentially helpful when you have a king who you want to make into a better person. So if you can raise the royal family to essentially look pretty and do as little as possible, then you've got a figurehead you can put in front of the public while everyone else runs around and does back deals and runs the country. Is this what they have in England? I'm not sure. I will also definitely admit that the reason I keep referencing Game of Thrones is because a bunch of the reaction channels I watch are all watching that show for the first time, and it's a useful source of inspiration because 4 of those seasons were really good TV. Okay, so if we're riffing on the idea of Camelot, and our Arthur is long gone and our Excalibur is kind of still in play, but right now it seems like no one is able to wield it, what's up with our Merlin? He can obviously just be dead. In D&D, human wizards don't tend to live that much longer than anybody else, so nobody would question if he just died a long time ago. But that is also such a boring answer. I don't want him to be dead, and certainly not of old age. I like the trope of the ancient wizard helping out new generations over time. Sure, that idea kind of started with Merlin, I guess, but it really evolved with characters like Gandalf or Yoda. Of course, neither of those characters are human, and our wizard was human. I want the old white-haired wizard archetype. But how do you reconcile how he's still alive? Well, I actually don't have to, because I actually don't want him to still be a member of the court advising each king. Because once again, if there's a good and powerful wizard helping run the government, it becomes a lot more difficult to explain why they're not solving all the problems our heroes are dealing with. This is the tension I always grapple with whenever I'm world building. I like the idea of allowing your D&D world to be a little more magical than a normal fantasy world. I like the idea of making villages that are on the border of other planes of existence, or enchanted crowns, or other magic that's just able to elevate this world and make it a little weirder. But I also don't like institutional wizardry tied into the government. I don't mind having a faction of wizards, maybe even a faction of wizards with a lot of political influence. But when they just become another branch of the government, as bureaucratic as any other faction, and when they're all high-level wizards, and when they're fundamentally altruistic, I just think that opens up a world-building rabbit hole. Even before J.K. Rowling's infamous fall from grace, where she showed her ass and we found out that her head was all the way up it was already very well known that her wizarding world didn't really make a lot of sense. Something that, much like the rest of the franchise, only got worse with the Fantastic Beasts movies. But in D&D, I think it actually can be even worse, because when you go down the world-building rabbit hole and start pulling on that thread and asking all these questions about these high-level wizards tied into the government and acting in public service, at the bottom of that rabbit hole is always the same question. Okay, then why don't these wizards solve the problems for our players? You're always going to have some of that whenever there's any authority in a fantasy world, even if it's just an army or a powerful thieves guild. If the players can reach out to somebody to help solve their problem, you have to figure out why that isn't just going to stop the adventure dead in its tracks. No matter how much world building you do, that's never not going to be a factor. But I feel like with a faction of wizards, it's so much worse. It's part of my issue with Amon and Tal'Dorei, and less of an issue with Wildemount, partially because in Wildemount, the wizard faction is so clearly up to their own shit. I have a much easier time believing some high-level wizards wormed their way into running the government, much more so than the idea that high-level wizards have agreed to just sit around and monitor teleportation sigils like they're magical elevator operators. So let's return to our Merlin equivalent. I like the idea that this wizard was an advisor to the king. He did have institutional power, which he was using altruistically. But I'm kind of opposed to all the storytelling implications that generates if that's still the case today. So I think he's gone. After our Arthur equivalent died centuries ago, the wizard left on a mission and never returned. And for some reason, his apprentices all had to go into hiding, and we don't know why. His tower is still here, but nobody can get into it. It's essentially a magical dungeon, and every once in a while someone tries to get inside, but they literally can't get into it. So the seat of the court wizard is empty, which means the only person who would have enough power to actually stop all these other factions from fighting each other and running the government has basically completely given up his seat at the table, which means there's no resistance to whatever politics they want to do other than their own personal infighting. And that was probably not the right call for that wizard to do. It kind of reminds me of Avatar again. Somebody wise and powerful should have stopped the status quo before it happened, but they vanished. So clearly, they were not able to stop the rise of these political factions that are now causing a lot of problems. Also, I briefly toyed with the idea of making this wizard the judge, a version of my own character from another setting, but I actually don't want to go down that route, specifically because I like being a lot more ambiguous about the history and backstory and motivations of our Merlin equivalent. I might steal some of the ideas I had for the judge as an NPC before I decided to make him a PC again, but otherwise I'm going to keep these as separate characters. So this Merlin equivalent is not the judge. So now that the wizard is gone and we have all these other factions in the government that are trying to basically bypass the king and do whatever they want, clawing over each other for control of the country, but they still have to do so within the setup of the system that's already in place. Like, they can't ask the king to create a new cabinet position or whatever, because sometimes when the king does something, an axe just falls and kills him. So now these factions just don't ask for anything anymore. They just work with what exists. If there's something they need to do that's not covered by the rules, they'll just try to break the rules and get away with it, rather than try to amend the rules, because they don't think they're going to be able to amend the rules without potentially losing the king, and it's just not worth the risk. This is such a fun fantasy, the idea of these political factions breaking all the rules and just getting away with it. I truly don't know where this idea comes from. Certainly no real-world constitutional crises that have been playing out for the past 11 months. No, this is my own brilliance. I came up with this idea out of nowhere. Now, in Game of Thrones, we have the small council. The king theoretically sits down with all of his advisors, and they bring him matters to discuss. Obviously, the King of Doriad isn't getting any real issues presented to him, but we would still have these advisors, and each one is probably the head of their own faction. In Game of Thrones, we've got the Hand of the King, the Grand Maester, Master of Coin, Master of Laws, Master of Ships, Master of Whisperers, and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. We probably don't need all of these. We probably only want 3, maybe 4 factions in our world. The reason why is because otherwise it's just too much for the players to track. Sure, Game of Thrones had more than 4 factions. They called it the War of 5 Kings. Let's start with that. And that didn't even include Daenerys. But that is what the entire story was about. And again, most of our main characters were dealing with the leaders of these factions. Also, some of those kings really didn't stick around all that long. And I actually do have ideas for more factions in the world, even in the capital itself. But I think aiming for just 3 or 4 in the sort of government faction, in the castle itself, is a good start. Plus, Mystic Arts made a video about using 3 factions to play off each other. That's definitely an influence here. Now, again, we're trying to come up with which factions we're going to represent. Dale Kingsmill made a video about world building and the different sorts of aspects of a world you might want to consider. And that's very useful to keep in mind so we're not only riffing off of Game of Thrones, but considering other influences as well. She said that when you're building a new settlement, there are 5 categories you want to consider: social, political, economic, religious, and military. So let's think about our factions. Normally there would be a magical faction, but there's no court wizard anymore. So maybe there's some sort of ritual to appoint one, or a particular magic item they would need to present. Like in House of the Dragon, whenever there's a small council meeting, they have to take these small stones and place them in front of themselves. So maybe there's something similar for the high court wizard or whatever. Some sort of gem or ring or seal that recognizes their authority. But nobody knows where that is. They might suspect it's in the tower, but nobody can go in and get it. If anybody's able to find that ring, they would basically be able to appoint whoever they wanted to be the court wizard. And that would be a game changer. But nobody can create their own version of it because probably the original wizard, our version of Merlin, crafted the first one, and no one knows how he did it. And there's some sort of spell or ward that keeps a wizard from joining the council meeting without presenting the seal. But of course, there's nothing to stop the other wizards and mages from meeting with other faction leaders, so there are other wizards in the government, or working with the government in illicit ways. They're just not part of our small council equivalent. So there isn't a wizard faction in the court. There's obviously no Hand of the King, because that would give whoever's a member of that faction way too much institutional power. The king does have attendants, but he doesn't have a chief advisor, or a second in command, or a chief of staff, because I feel like that would eliminate all the dramatic potential we're trying to set up. Let's go back to those 2 lists. For Dale's list, religious would be its own thing that we're going to have to get to another time. That is just going to be a whole other topic. Social would be kind of the same. It's very useful in developing a settlement, but it doesn't really apply to what we're trying to do right now. Politics, okay, that's kind of everything we're doing, so it's too broad to be useful here. That leaves economic and military. Returning to Game of Thrones, we have the economic side of things represented by the Master of Coin, and military is represented by the Master of Ships and the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, who is basically the head of the City Watch. There's no head of the army, because essentially all the armies report to the noble lords, so each individual lord's alliance is really important for figuring out which side their army will take. I think we're going to steal that approach here as well. It lines up with the idea of the Knights of the Round Table. Each knight is a lord who has their own army, and they can basically report to the king with their needs and share information, which helps keep any small problems from getting bigger and threatening everyone. Except obviously, because the king is sequestered from any major decisions these days, these meetings just don't happen anymore. Sometimes a knight will still come to court to request an audience, but usually they're just going to end up making a backroom deal with one of the other factions who's actually running things. And honestly, at that point, it just doesn't make sense to come to court yourself. You could just send an emissary. The king can still knight people, and you might still expect to see the knights come into town for tourneys, weddings, and funerals, but those have basically become opportunities for the factions to make deals and affirm alliances. The king isn't doing any governing anymore. So we're going to say that there isn't a master of war, because basically anybody who controls a single army would have too much power. Instead, we're going to follow the Game of Thrones model, where there's no single standing army. Instead, all these nobles spread across the country have their own men-at-arms who they can call to battle, which essentially means that these lords are kind of independent governments of their own. They have to handle their own problems. This is a little bit more small government states' rights than I would typically prefer for a world I was actually living in, but the point here is that this system actually prevents problems from getting dealt with the way they should, which leaves the door open for more D&D adventures, which is obviously the point here. I think the same probably goes for ships. Someone owns the ships, there's no master of ships. Although maybe the person who owns the ships is our equivalent of our master of coin. Or maybe not, we'll come back to that later, but there's a wealthy person who bought a spot on the council because they own all the ships. They're the master of trade, let's say. We're not going to necessarily use that term, but that's sort of the equivalent. And it may not be a noble in the traditional sense. It may not be a Tywin Lannister, who's a very wealthy lord. I think it's a representative of a merchant guild. Way back in my Pirates of the Caribbean video, I introduced a faction called the Doriad Imperial Enterprise, basically an analog of the East India Trading Company. I think the head of this guild is also in charge of trade for the entire country. Once again, I don't actually like it in the real world when a government official is directly tied into a corporation, or when they try to privatize government functions. I think that's very bad, actually. But it makes for a very interesting world for our adventures, because it makes it a lot harder to try to recruit the Navy to solve your problems, when half the time the Navy is actually really focused on trade more so than they are on defense. So you wouldn't be able to recruit them unless you can find some sort of incentive to make it worth their while. Now, I didn't just want to be a knockoff Game of Thrones world, so I looked at some other lists as well, like the original Cabinet of the United States of America. And honestly, the idea of the cabinet was probably a major influence on the small council from Game of Thrones. A lot of the positions have a one-to-one analog. Game of Thrones has a Master of Laws, George Washington had the Attorney General. And I realized, you know what we need? Basically a Justice Department. I mean, again, I would like one of those in real life that actually functioned and prosecuted legitimate crimes rather than going after the president's political opponents and giving sweetheart deals to child traffickers. But for this world, having someone who is not just responsible for keeping track of the laws, but also for enforcing the laws, that's someone who could be really powerful in an intrigue situation like this. You can fold in the commander of the King's Guard, captain of the City Watch as well, so this isn't just someone who advises people on what's legal and suggests new laws for the kings to pass, back when they actually allowed the king to do things. But now they're also responsible for putting people in prison, which makes them a very dangerous faction to be on the wrong side of. After all, if this individual can come up with some charges they think can stick, they can get you arrested, which is a nice way of dealing with the agents of enemy factions. Now, what about a Master of Whispers type? Should there be a Spy Master? Or rather, should there be a main Spy Master? Because I think all of these factions have spies and probably have their own Spy Masters. Besides, I like the idea that each faction basically has their own armed forces that they can just walk around the capital city and travel to any other city and start barking orders. These armed units walking around executing the will of their factions. This means the players are potentially at risk of getting discovered doing something that would not be in alignment with one of these factions, and they could potentially face repercussions right there in the middle of the street. For the Chief Justice, or whatever he's called, for Attorney General equivalent, it's obvious who these armed agents would be. They're the city guard patrolling the capital. For our Master of Trade, it's basically both the Navy and also private security who worked for the Doriad Imperial Enterprise. This is actually what makes a Master of War so tempting. Just having members of the army as a third faction would be so nice and easy. But I still maintain that I think I like the idea that you don't necessarily know which faction any individual army might be aligned with, because those armies report to lords, and those lords are involved in the different factions in the capital. And it would also help with our D&D adventures to, when you call in the army for help, you're not getting the entire resources of the nationwide army. You're getting one lord's army, which is a more isolated sort of unit. Besides, it would also be very strange to see all these different lords' armies walking around the capital city, so I don't think it works for our idea. Additionally, this is another reason why I don't think we're going to have a Master of Whispers. I don't know who those armed agents would be if they're working for a Spy Master. However, maybe we can combine the idea of armed agents with the idea of some sort of espionage group and create basically a secret police. That's what the Dai Li was in Avatar: The Last Airbender. They had other justifications for existing, but functionally, they were just secret police. They would scoop up anybody who they deemed to be enemies and make them disappear with no accountability or oversight. Now, typically, we would assume that the secret police equivalent would work for the Department of Justice equivalent, but that does not have to be the case. After all, right now in the USA, we have secret police running around and demanding to see people's papers and detaining people without due process, but they're not part of the Justice Department, they're part of Homeland Security. They are theoretically meant to deal with illegal immigration, even though that's obviously not what they're actually doing. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, the Dai Li were in charge of the cultural heritage of the city. I always took that to mean that they're like a historical preservation society or something, at least when I was younger, when I was in college and first watched the show. But functionally, they actually just put down rebellions and squash political dissonance, as well as other more sinister things like brainwashing people. So what would be the stated goal of a faction that might have their own secret police in our world? This is the one time I kind of wish I had a faction of wizards, because I would love a wizardry secret police, but I'm going to stick to my guns that the secret police can employ some mages, just like any other faction can, but they were not founded by mages. I don't want it to just be the Master of Secrets, because I like the idea that the secret police belong to a faction you wouldn't expect. You would expect them to have some sort of representatives out there, but you wouldn't expect them to be disappearing people. That's why they're different from the Justice Department equivalent as well. The Justice Department has to figure out a legal or legal adjacent justification to get rid of their enemies. This faction has their own secret police, so they can just make their enemies vanish. And this is when I came back to the idea that maybe we still have a Master of Coin, or again, whatever we call it. These are temporary terms, you can follow along with my reasoning, but maybe the Treasury actually is different from the Trade Department. Maybe Trade really is more like the Navy. I lumped them together for the terms of my Pirates of the Caribbean video anyway, because they fill exactly the same role narratively, and all those Navy ships in those movies work for that company, but there's probably somebody else who's in charge of actually tracking the money of the economy of this country. And this is also the key part. Maybe they also collect the taxes. Typically, that's something people would directly do with their lord, and I think that's true out in the countryside, but someone else has to go out there and get the king's share of the taxes from those lords, and they still have to collect the taxes within the capital itself. And I think maybe this would also be an organization that serves as the guards of the citadel, and they keep our king safe, our equivalent of a king's guard, but also the equivalent of the real-world Secret Service. Some of you might not know this, but the Secret Service was originally created by Abraham Lincoln to investigate financial crimes like counterfeiting, because there was a big problem with that after the Civil War. But extremely ironically, given who founded them, their job was not to try to prevent political assassinations. It wasn't even until the second presidential assassination in 1901 that somebody realized, okay, we really got to keep an eye on these guys. And that's when the Secret Service started acting as the bodyguards for major political figures. I like the idea that our Secret Service equivalent is kind of a blend with the IRS. They might investigate you on suspicion of improper taxes, but they could also justify any investigation under the idea that you might be a threat to the king. And if they want to, they could just make you vanish. Then there's an expression among people in the capital. Nobody but the treasurer knows what's in the vaults, or whatever we end up calling the treasurer equivalent. But I like that a lot. Now, just like with the people who live in Ba Sing Se, if you're new to the city, if you're new to the capital, you have no idea what people are scared of the Dai Li, or our IRS equivalent. But everyone who lives there knows that if you step out of line, you can just vanish with absolutely no oversight. This also makes me chuckle because the Republicans have recently been so fear-mongering about armed IRS agents back when Biden increased their budget. And the real reason they said all that stuff is because the more IRS agents there are, the more people who are very, very wealthy get audited, and Republicans don't like that for some reason. Democrats don't really either, but Republicans definitely don't. However, I just cannot resist that Treasury Vault analogy. It's truly perfect. Republicans have a knack for creating compelling narratives. It's kind of the only reason they keep getting elected, but even though everything they believe is based on a lie, some of those dramatic ideas behind those lies are still really useful when we're creating our own world. And I do trust my own skills as a world builder to adapt these ideas a little bit more so they don't really bear a strong resemblance to the propaganda that inspired them. Additionally, if this faction, this Secret Service equivalent, is responsible for protecting the king and his family, then it stands to reason that they're the ones who are also training and conditioning the royal family to try to make them as worthy-seeming as possible. You would probably have people in that role who genuinely cared about the little princes and princesses, and wanted to make sure they grew up to be good people. Not just because they cared about them, but also because if they ever reach the point where they're sitting and kneeling for a coronation, well, before they get the crown on their head, they have to wait to see if the axe might drop and cut their head off their body. And even once they are wearing the crown, there's always a chance that that crown will get split in two if they do something wrong and the axe comes down on them. So they would really be invested in making sure that these little princes and princesses were the best people possible. Even the moment where the kings kneel before they get their crown and they have to wait to see if the axe cuts off their head, they are theoretically supposed to view this as a moment of humility, so they can remember that their role is to serve the people. So because these kings and queens are being raised in such a way where they should all be considered good people, because they're all protected from making difficult choices, hopefully that means there hasn't been a cloven king in generations where the axe comes down and cuts their head in half. I think this Treasury Department equivalent is probably really frustrated that they can't use the fact that they have unlimited access to the king and the royal family at all times. They can't use that to their advantage because they don't want to get another execution. It literally doesn't serve them at all to have the king put his seal on anything, because maybe they've tried that. Maybe the king has assigned something or agreed to some law without reading it, and they were immediately executed. And that's a bad look. Even if the king is just a figurehead, you don't want that to happen. So they just don't do that anymore. Everyone just goes around the king, including the people who are keeping the king safe and have his ear at all times. They're insulating him, but they don't really use him as a resource, just as a justification for what they want to do, like the Dai Li. And that's frustrating to them because that's such a useful resource, but it's just too risky. But they might occasionally push their luck, but that's something that would definitely not everyone in the faction would agree to. That would be a bit of an out-of-the-box move. Also, speaking of out-of-the-box thinking, you have to imagine somebody at some point wondered, what would happen if we swapped out a baby? What happens next? Did the handlers of the royal family ever try to replace a ruler before they took the throne when they were just a little baby? If they ever got to the point where they were coronated, did the axe notice? Did it care? I have my own answers to those questions that I don't necessarily want to share today because I like leaving that open as a plot hook if someone else wants to run a game in this world once it's all finished. I mean, if finished is a relative term. I could keep building this world forever, but I mean finished as in I finally come up with some names and I put this in a PDF. So these are the members of the King's Council. And once again, these are not the final terms. This is just broad strokes as I take you behind the curtain. But these council members would include a treasurer, a trade department, a justice department, and a wizard who's been absent for generations. Now, originally this video was going to go on and discuss the church and all the different factions of the different temples, worshiping different gods and how much power they might have over the government. But honestly, I'm going to have to break that off into its own video because that became a much bigger topic that was getting pretty unwieldy. So my goal today is just to keep focused on the government structure of this kingdom, which we just did. But already we can see that this is really fertile ground. There's enough room to introduce other smaller factions that maybe don't have a big position in the government or a role at all, but they can still be involved in these adventures, like an organized religion or secret societies, or obviously all the different cults that will pop up in all my games. We also have a really good starting position for things to get really shaken up when there's a change in the status quo. That change could be something caused by the heroes, like on one of their D&D adventures, they do something that they don't realize it necessarily, but will wind up tipping the balance in the favor of one of these factions, maybe kind of dramatically, which would more gradually introduce our heroes to this faction system through the consequences of one of their own adventures. Or we could have an inciting incident that functionally acts as a starting gun for all these different factions to try hiring adventurers and going on different missions, all tied into some event, like a war. Or the perfect example would be that the Wizard's Tower finally gets unsealed. Suddenly, all these factions would want to send people into the tower to try to find the ring or seal or gemstone or whatever it is that identifies somebody as the court wizard. So that way they can secure that position for one of the wizards in their own employ. And once they do that, they can essentially have a whole second faction in their pocket, because they would have another faction leader publicly acknowledged by the rules of the land, by the law, who would then have his own ability to put together his own team and his own agents. The appointing of a new court wizard would be a huge status quo change for the city and for the country. But that can only happen if somebody can get through this magical mega dungeon hidden within this wizard's tower. Once again, the purpose of these factions is to invite more opportunities to tell different adventures. That's all. And I think I've given myself a few really good factions in order to do that. Of course, the next actual step is to find some way to represent these factions with NPCs. You can't just tell your players that there's a trading company that owns all the ships. It will only mean anything to the players if it comes into play in the course of an adventure. And the only way that can happen, literally the only way any faction can do anything, is if agents of that faction do something on behalf of the factions they serve. So not only do I need to figure out who runs each of these factions, but whenever I sit down for a new adventure, I would also need to come up with an NPC who essentially represents that faction in this specific quest or subplot. It's not just enough to say that Nick Fury runs S.H.I.E.L.D. from wherever he lives. You also need to introduce somebody like Agent Phil Coulson, who can represent these factions on the ground level, in the early days where these players are just starting to understand these factions and what they represent. Of course, part of the reason you need an NPC to essentially represent this faction is because players have a really hard time imagining what a faction is like and what they're going to be like, unless you actually personify them. But once you've done that, even then, some players might still have a hard time remembering some of the details they've learned, just because there's so much going on at the table. Maybe they didn't fully make the connection to some of the details you deliver to them during the game. So it would be really nice if your players didn't have to rely only on their own memories or their own abilities to take notes, because you had another way you could deliver information to the players to help them keep track of the things they've learned. And especially helpful in circumstances like today, this resource could also give you a way to track this information yourself, so you don't have to rely on your own memory or your own limited ability to keep track of your notes. And that's why today's video is sponsored by World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that you can use to create articles of anything in your world, including monsters, magic items, NPCs, gods, and, most relevant to today's purposes, nations and factions. In fact, when you're building one of these articles, you're actually given a whole bunch of different prompts that you can use to inspire you by asking questions that you might not have thought of otherwise. For example, a new page for a faction might ask you who the founder of that faction was, or when it was founded. If you don't have an interesting answer to that question, you can leave it blank. That's not a big deal. But if that question gets your wheels spinning and gets you thinking about who would have been the advisors to our King Arthur equivalent, that could potentially be a very interesting question, because it might actually change what people would think of that faction in the world of the game. That might also get you thinking about the way this faction has changed over time, becoming corrupted and drifting away from their original goal. And that might get you thinking about how long it took for that process to play out. Was it immediate? Did it take generations? Did it take centuries? All of a sudden, now you have a reason to answer the question of when this organization was founded, because it's not just trivia now. It's actually relevant because it helps to characterize what level of corruption the players should expect from the agents involved. Additionally, there are absolutely going to be secrets you don't want your players to know about yet, but good news, you can still write them down in these articles, but you can actually hide the information from your players. So that way they can browse these articles themselves and they won't actually see the secrets you have up your sleeve. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. That is more than half off. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. And thanks so much for watching. Like I said, I have ideas for more videos about this setting as I keep adding details to it. You can probably look forward to seeing the religion video soonest, since that video is almost done being written. It was originally going to be part of this one, so it's halfway done already. But if there's another particular aspect of this world you'd like to see me flesh out in the future, let me know, because I'm hoping that this process of building my world in front of you can help show you how I do it, which can hopefully help those of you who are trying to build your own worlds see how it's done, or at least see how I do it. So if you've been struggling with a particular aspect of your own setting and you'd like to see how I might do it in my own world, let me know in the comments. Or if you're just getting invested and interested in this world that I'm creating and you're particularly curious about seeing another side of this world get rendered, let me know that too. Let me know which parts of the world you most want to see fleshed out. In the meantime, I've got some other really cool videos coming out, including a video about dungeon design that you should be seeing this week, as well as another episode of Critical Role Demystified. Can't forget that, or I guess the algorithm wizard will get me or whatever, make me disappear like the secret police or whatever. Yeah, I have to figure out what's going to happen if I screw over the algorithm wizard. He did make my future self vanish, and I haven't figured out what happened with that. I gotta do some digging. But if you're a fan of this channel, this is going to be a great week for you. And so if you want to see these videos and you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, make sure you get notified whenever I post a new video. And if you missed the video where I first started building this world, this campaign setting, check it out right here. Until next time, play fair and have fun.